I can see why Albertans and stakeholders may have concerns about some of these projects, especially with new technologies, with battery storage, with nuclear, with SMRs. Like all these things, of course, people are going to have questions. And I think if we see that as a bad thing, then you're really missing the opportunity to make your project better.
Welcome to Under Review, powered by Ultimarii, the interview series where we unpack the decisions that shape what gets permitted and what gets delayed across North America. Each episode, we sit down with regulators, subject matter experts, practitioners, and project leaders to break down the rules, the realities, and the playbook for getting critical infrastructure approved.
My name is Kirsten Hansen, and I'm your host today. I am very pleased to have our guest with us today, Kimberly Howard. Welcome, Kim.
Thanks for having me.
Kim has a deep history in energy and environmental law in Canada. Kim is a partner at McCarthy Tétrault here in Calgary, where she co-leads the National Environmental Group. Her practice covers energy, environmental law across the full spectrum of the sector, pipelines, oil and gas, electric utilities, renewables, battery storage, and carbon markets. She has appeared before virtually every major regulator in Canada and has taught regulatory theory at the U of C Faculty of Law. Kim is consistently ranked as a leading lawyer in energy and environmental law by Chambers Global, Chambers Canada, and the Legal 500 Canada. Kim, first I'd love to hear how you found your way into energy and environmental law. Was there a moment in your early career that shaped this path?
That's a tough question. I mean, I did start my legal career working at NMAX as a summer student, which was by happenstance. That was just where I was able to find a job as a summer student. And so from that, I learned about electricity, just how interesting it was and how complicated it was and how scared people were of electricity regulation. People shied away from it. And then I went and articled. And as I was articling, I realized really quickly that I like building things. I like working on tangible things. So I actually started my career in our commercial real property group at McCarthy Tétrault. So I spent 5 years there because I liked being able to look across the street and say I'm working on that building, or go drive a development and say I was working on that. And from real estate, I actually think real estate lawyers know more about environmental law than people give them credit for. They're really good environmental lawyers. They're touching dirt, soil, water every day. So I really loved my environmental practice from day one, but I wanted to do more environmental, and I really enjoyed my time at NMAX, so I tried to bring those two together and finally make it into energy.
Your breadth of practice in the industry is quite wide-ranging. It spans oil and gas, renewables, battery, carbon markets, utilities. How did you come to kind of cover that breadth of topics?
I think that comes from being curious and also just being willing to, when somebody comes with a new file, saying, hey, I don't know, but I'll learn. So I've always loved the law. So it's just come from being really interested, and as policy develops and kind of going with the changing times and the changing times of projects and just being willing to learn about them. So like the last 4 or 5 years have been a lot of nuclear. So that is another new area that I've been able to do as an Alberta lawyer.
So tell me about that. I mean, our nuclear industry in Alberta specifically is in its infancy, if you can call it that. And so what about that has been interesting or challenging to you?
I think it's an entirely different regulatory regime. It's very federal based. It's through the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And they're really massive projects. They can be quite big with new technologies. So it's a lot of learning. It's a great regulator that's new and different. And it spans a lot of different provinces. So it's just been fun and a steep learning curve.
A steep learning curve, yeah, I can imagine. And so when something like that is new from a regulatory or a policy perspective in a jurisdiction that you're operating, what do you look to for inspiration or reference or sources of information?
You really look to the other jurisdictions and the existing projects that are already built and operating. I mean, we've had nuclear in Canada for a long time with the CANDU reactors and everything that's going on in Ontario and New Brunswick. So you look to those projects and see how they've been regulated and the decisions that come out of that. Nuclear itself is very international based, and the lessons learned and the regulation is shared across jurisdictions, so not only within Canada, but with other countries and the International Atomic Agency and all the international treaties. So you can really draw on the learnings from all the other projects across the world.
And from your perspective, as these projects are kind of proposed and scoped, even outside of the regulatory process, what hurdles do you think that they're going to face to actually start being built in Canada?
Depends on the type of project, but I think a lot of it is educating the public, the stakeholders, spending a lot of time upfront researching who is this going to impact, how is this going to impact them, how can I mitigate that, and really spending a lot of upfront research time and understanding the project and the impacts and what's going to happen. So I think the upfront investment is really driving a lot of it at the beginning.
Has it changed kind of how you think about working with these different industries, between oil and gas, between renewables? Where are there similarities and where are there differences?
I think there's a lot of similarities. I think you can draw on the lessons learned in different industries, do things better. Some do things better than others when it comes to stakeholder engagement or, linear projects, whether it's a pipeline or a transmission line. I think you can learn from the stakeholder engagement across it, the routing issues, ways to mitigate those things. So I think drawing on each of the different industries, you can really take the best of each of them, quite frankly, as well as the experts in there. So there's a lot of great industry experts out there that help with human health risk assessment, with routing, with fisheries, with all the technical engineering, and really drawing on everybody's strengths early on to design the project in the best way, and then to consult and talk to all the stakeholders about it.
And so you've had these experience in all these different types of projects, but also with all these different types of regulators. You've appeared before the CER, the AER, AUC, EAB, the BC tribunals. What's it actually like to work across bodies with different cultures and expectations? Like, how has your experience been different across these tribunals?
I think the level of public participation in each of them can differ a bit. So some regulators will allow more participation at different levels, whether somebody can just even file a letter of comment or if they have to participate as a full intervener, or the level of who can actually intervene differs by regulator. So I think it's fun to see that different process, but also to navigate, okay, who are the stakeholders we're going to be dealing with, who can participate in our hearing, and what is that going to do to our process. The level of rigor and kind of evidentiary requirements differs by process as well as the timelines. So, yeah. But again, they're similar. Each of them have their rules of practice, and you kind of just follow those as the guidebook. And again, draw from the similarities. And the differences are not as, they just call them different things. Yeah. It's just different names for everything.
So tell me about how the intervener process or information request specifically can be a tool in this to seek information.
Well, I think it's definitely a tool at the beginning when you're trying to socialize your project, kind of do the public notification and stakeholder engagement that needs to happen at the beginning. And seeking feedback and really listening to what the impacts and what people's concerns are, because maybe you can make changes early on. Yeah. From municipalities, from Indigenous groups, from just the neighbor who's next door. And so I think the more that they listen, you can gather a lot of information for your application and maybe add a new expert that might help alleviate some of the concerns. So I think the more reactive people are willing to be in that position and to invest maybe in furthering their application or adding some more technical information, I think is always helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Like, I can see why Albertans and stakeholders may have concerns about some of these projects, especially with new technologies, with battery storage, with nuclear, with SMRs. Like all these things, of course, people are going to have questions. And I think if we see that as a bad thing, then you're really missing the opportunity to make your project better.
Yeah, that's a great insight from someone who's worked that and lived with it. I mean, you hear about these things as delays, but sometimes they're necessary delays to make sure all of the perspectives are heard to get these projects built in a way that suits communities and local groups. And so in kind of your last comment, you mentioned battery storage. And so I know that that's something that you've worked on a fair bit. And in the past 10 years, that's relatively new technology. So similar to your experience with nuclear, like how do you navigate something that is brand new or that hasn't necessarily been done?
I think it can be challenging. There can be a lot of misinformation. I think people can get scared of new technology, whether it's emergency response when it comes to batteries and what a fire department may need to respond to a battery fire, for example. But it's about getting the information out there early and getting ahead of it so that the misinformation or the fears don't take over. But it's definitely a challenge.
And what are some of those strategies that you've relied on or used to get that information out or with clients that you've worked on?
I think the best strategies is really engaging the right experts, the people who actually have the experience, and getting them in front of the stakeholders as soon as possible and early. And if you don't understand your stakeholders' concerns, you can't figure out how to solve for it. So I think it's really getting that information early, although it can be hard with some stakeholders, because if they're learning as the process goes, their concerns are evolving. So sometimes throughout the hearing process, a stakeholder's concerns can change, or they might realize that they should have been worried about something. So you have to be able to be nimble and reactive.
So tell me about when someone brings you a major project or a new thing that you're working on. What does the approval process actually look like from your side? What are some of these real steps when you're getting started?
When I'm getting started, so it depends. Clients come to us at different times. I prefer a client come to us as early as possible before they've done their application, because we really like to, we've got a lot of consultants and experts that we like to work with. We know the ones that have appeared before the regulators before, those that kind of have given credible evidence or good on cross-examination, or industry experts. So I think the earlier you can get involved in an application, I prefer that. So it's usually talking about the experts, the application requirements, how they're going to formulate it, also sitting down and talking about the stakeholder plan. Often clients will work with different external consultants to help with the stakeholder engagement, which is great. We're happy to work with them too, but just kind of getting ahead of all of that and getting in early. So we spend a lot of time in application preparation and strategy and working through it. Sometimes we get applications that are already filed and have to step in.
Yeah.
That can be good or bad. Sometimes it's harder because then you're dealing with a baked application that you have to respond to. But you just keep working with it.
And so for that typical application strategy process, I'm sure it varies for project, but on average, how long does that take?
Depends on the project, depends on how complicated the project. It can take anywhere from, depends how long it takes to get land tenure, if you're going to get a lease or you're going to buy the property. I mean, it could take anywhere from 3 to 4 months to a year, depending on if you need to get wildlife surveys or certain environmental studies of the property that go into the application. It can take a bit longer.
And have you found that that differs based on the jurisdiction that you're operating in, or is that kind of consistent across the board?
I'd say that's pretty consistent across the board, and it depends on the nature of the inputs into the application, whether you need wildlife studies, and do those need to be based on seasonal restrictions? What kind of experts do you need? What kind of land tenure do you need? What kind of property rights? Things like that, it filters in, but it's pretty consistent.
And through that process, and maybe not just in the application development, maybe it's later in the process, where do you find are the biggest bottlenecks?
I think the bottlenecks are on application completeness, when people are going through and the regulators are reviewing their application and asking either for more details or information requests. I think that can be a lengthy process. So that's why it's really great to get involved early to make sure the application includes everything that they need and all the requirements. And then the other part is really if there's stakeholders that object. That is a huge bottleneck because that can trigger the lengthier hearing processes and regulatory processes.
Additionally, you've worked on transactions and financing as well as it ties into these projects. And so how does regulatory uncertainty show up in that world?
Everywhere. I mean, it happens everywhere. It happens in lenders trying to figure out when they can advance funds, what should be conditions to funding, how far along is the project, timelines, closing deadlines. Like, it shows up quite a bit. There's also the appeal risk. Like, we saw that the AUC reviewed and varied one of their own decisions after they'd issued it. Things like that can really kind of put a hiccup in transactions and can scare lenders because they're trying to figure out what's going on. Maybe they've already advanced and now the application's no longer approved as they thought. Or maybe somebody's closed on the transaction and it gets kind of reviewed and varied. It can really change things from a commercial perspective.
And what types of information can you provide to give some of that certainty, or like how do you navigate that complexity?
It's difficult. I think a lot of it is just talking about when things do become certain, and at one point does it become that the developer just needs to keep taking the steps and they'll be able to stay in the process, or where there's a risk that they might get denied. I mean, I think the material projects like an Alberta Utilities Commission approval or an Alberta Environment approval for a natural gas generation, those are kind of critical, and so typically transactions will require those before a lender funds or before somebody will close on acquiring that type of project. So some of the things you just have to wait to see how it unfolds, and other things we really just have to give a lot of memos and research about what the regulatory process is and what certain milestones are, so that, you know, a lender or an investor can kind of do checks and balances to see, are we hitting the milestones? Do we need to be concerned? Are there red flags? And really just either mapping out the regulatory process or waiting until there's some certainty in it.
What do you think investors misunderstand about that process?
I think that's the hardest part, is when I don't have a good answer for them. Yeah. When will I know? Why won't? Or I think there's also, some people get a bit confused as to how much. They're like, well, but the minister of X really wants to get this project done. Well, that's fine, but the AUC is a quasi-judicial body who will make their decision in accordance with procedural fairness and, you know, the rules and rules of natural justice that they need to abide by. So some of these processes just have to unfold.
Yeah. Do you find that the systems in which you've operated, do they adapt in real time, or do you still see kind of a lack of clarity on some of those newer assets?
I think there's a lack of clarity on some of the assets. I think it's hard to move on those. I think if there's not a lot of demand for it, it sometimes is slow to change. Or it also means sometimes the technology is changing so fast that it's hard to come up with the right requirements. I think for batteries, one of the bigger impediments has been how they're treated through the ISO tariff. So they get charged this is an oversimplified version, but they get charged to discharge onto the grid, and they also get charged for transmission costs to pull. And so things like that we're still thinking about them either in this binary way of being load or generation, when something can actually be a hybrid. And so that can be a bit difficult. I think it's less hard for me and harder for those that are trying to invest in those technologies.
Yeah,
to find their revenue.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so, who ends up bearing that risk?
The investors and the generators.
Yeah.
Those companies really do. And I think Albertans, if we can't get some of that technology on, because battery storage could provide a lot of system reliability for us with a smaller footprint. So it is interesting that if we're not getting that, we are also, as ratepayers, paying that price too, but also the developers and investors in those industries.
So the demand for electricity and generation specifically is obviously a hot topic with things like data centers and just the increased usage of electricity. And so tell me about where that shows up in your practice.
Well, I think data centers is the hot topic. So there's been a lot of work going on about data centers. Alberta is really trying to position itself as a market that is attractive to it and trying to really incent that type of investment in Alberta. So I think that demand is going to be really growing. And then they've decided to do it. It's the BYOG, so bring your own generation. So now that they've allocated kind of that first tranche of load of capacity, and everyone's bringing their own generation. So there's been kind of an influx in natural gas generation right now. So we're seeing a lot more natural gas generation applications, co-located assets, things like that, it's really picking up on that side. So.
And do you think the regulatory regimes are equipped to handle kind of this volume of increase, or do you think we're going to have to see changes?
I think it can handle it. I think we may see some changes in how those behind the fence type generation assets are treated, maybe some different regulatory approvals, but I think right now, we have what we need to do it. It's just a matter of actually getting it done fast, like they want, and the timelines that the government and the data center developers want.
Thinking about kind of the regulatory design and what actually works. You've worked across multiple systems, and what elements do you think work well and should be replicated more broadly?
I think it works well when everybody knows the rules of the game and the timelines for that game. And so I think it works really, really well when the rules are followed, the timelines are adhered to as much as possible, and everybody can move forward with that certainty. Even though the outcome of the regulatory process may be unknown, you at least know the timeline and when you'll have a decision. And I think that helps. That helps with the commercial side behind it. It helps with investment. It helps as we're navigating it, quite frankly, for clients, including for their legal fees if a hearing doesn't stretch on. I think it gets really difficult when the rules are unknown, when the rules are constantly changing, or when the regulators have to respond to new issues, and so the process gets kicked longer, or there's interlocutory motions. Things like that can really cause it to fail and take a long time.
And have you been involved in proceedings where the rules have changed midway through, or how has that impacted things that you've worked on?
Some of the things we've looked at, you look at what happened to the renewables on the reclamation security last summer when they were required to have those. So that impacted some of the ongoing applications. In-flight applications had to come up with kind of what they were going to do to comply with it. Existing renewables right now are trying to figure out how they're going to comply with those requirements. So it can happen all the time. I think we've seen with a bunch of cancellations on projects what's happening with the restructured energy market. So those rules have changed. So what's happening with these projects is they don't know what their revenue stream is going to be, so a lot of people are pausing. So I think it does happen when the rules change, and it can be frustrating and uncertain. But I think most part, the Alberta projects tend to roll with the punches. So that's what's fun about being an Alberta lawyer.
If you could change one thing about how Canada permits projects today, while keeping kind of the process intact, what would it be?
Like anything?
Anything.
I wish that municipal, federal, and provincial were more aligned. And that there wasn't so much mixed messaging between them. I think that would really, really help if those levels of government could be going in the same direction. but they all have different and conflicting mandates and constituents who vote them in, so it gets very hard. But if I could change that, it would be all of them rowing in the same direction.
I guess you've kind of answered that of why that change hasn't happened already, but it's about their conflicting interests, right?
Well, and I think you've got different, for example, at the provincial level, you've got different ministers with different agendas. And I think sometimes the different agendas can impact the regulatory process in different ways and sometimes can conflict with each other. Whether it's trying to give more of an involvement to municipalities in, permitting processes and that public interest test before the AUC, while laudable, could also cause more uncertainty and can cause more constraints and uncertainty in that process by what is the municipal involvement, what is their say, what can they do. Things like that can really change and can get complicated real fast. And so I think it really, there's a lot of different conflicting factors that go in, and I think people don't realize sometimes the unintended consequences of different policies and how they interact.
If we are sitting here a decade from now, kind of looking back in this moment in Canada's regulatory history, what do you hope we'll be saying about it?
I hope from an electricity front in Alberta that we got through it, that we got through this market change and we've settled in and the investment signals are back and Alberta's a good place to invest again. I hope we have more oil going to Tidewater. I think another pipeline would be good, but that's the Albertan in me. I think just for revenue streams and how important it is to the economy, it'd be great if we could get that done, along with the carbon pricing. To me, they still go hand in hand, and just because we want to build more natural resources doesn't mean we have to completely abandon all those kind of carbon policies. So.
And you've been involved in some of the carbon capture projects too here in Alberta and elsewhere. And so tell me a little bit more about your involvement in those projects. How have those unfolded?
Those have been fun. I mean, that was one where the rules changed, right? We were working on some carbon capture storage projects, and then the government came out with the moratorium and saying they were only going to issue those in the middle of through kind of that hub process. So that was a change that happened kind of mid-development process for a lot of projects, so we had to pivot. But I mean, it's been interesting. Again, I think some of that stuff has kind of stayed waiting for what's happening with carbon pricing. I think there's a lot of certainty that needs to happen with the Pathways project. That'll be interesting to see what finally happens under the Canada-Alberta MOU. So a lot of these things need to go forward. And I think we just got to see how they end up unfolding over time.
Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you sharing your perspective. Conversations like this help make sense of how the systems actually work in practice, and I know our listeners take a lot from it.
Thank you for having me today.
Thanks so much.